back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today we are transported to the Georges V Hotel, Paris, 1959. The entire decade of the 1950s was a trying one for Saroyan. Divorce, gambling, and drinking had all worn down his spirit. At the Georges V, which he tells us is what all the rich Americans who stayed there called it, he believed he could grudgingly hunker down and work hard, writing to pay off his debts and his taxes. Named for the King of Britain, the Georges V sits in the 8th arrondissement and was actually built by an American in 1928. It catered to Americans because it kept one of its booking offices at the port of Cherbourg, where American travelers disembarked from transatlantic ocean liners. The hotel was purchased by a Frenchman when the stock market crashed. In 1996, a Saudi businessman purchased the hotel, renovated it, and renamed it the Four Seasons Georges V as it stands today. Saroyan's nightly rate in 1959 was $18, which was pricey, but he believed it was worth it to be able to write in a nice place, expecting that what he wrote would pay for the room and the federal taxes he owed, which came to about $50,000. Incidentally, producer Darryl Zanuck paid for Saroyan's stay anyway. 1959 is a memorable year for him. In most of his personal narrative collections, he references it in some way. He traveled the world that year, but came no closer to facing his demons. In Here Comes, There Goes, You Know Who, from 1961, he writes, "I was running away from the quicksand of gambling, the quicksand and lightning of myself, the quicksand, lightning, and snowstorm of my family, my people, my lineage, the unknown, the unknowable Saroyans." The year started with him selling his house in Malibu, a place that he loved and regretted having to leave. He then went to New York briefly, which didn't satisfy, and then Belgrade, Italy, and Paris. In Zagreb, Yugoslavia, he was hired to work on a film. Ja, Yugoslav is a written film idea held at the Stanford Archives. The movie project was canceled, however, and his plans for that money were dashed. He bought a Karmann Ghia for $1,400 and drove around Europe, gambling away his money wherever he went. Finally, he landed in Paris, where he didn't want to be, but where he felt he could settle down and do some work. Needing money, he contacted Darryl Zanuck, former head of 20th Century Fox, who was living in Paris, and pitched an idea which Zanuck bought for $60,000. This was The Dogs, or the Paris Comedy. Its scripted version was called Lily Dauphin, but the Paris Comedy became a successful stage play, translated into German in Vienna and Berlin that year. He called this a cabbage. He explains a cabbage is any writing that's done for money and doesn't belong to the writer. He was generally against doing these, but he needed money that year. Later in 1959, Zanuck paid him $20,000 to rewrite a piece Zanuck already owned, based on a courtroom novel. This was settled out of court, a collaboration with the writer Harry Cecil, which was produced in London that year. He resented selling his work to Zanuck, giving his talent away for peanuts. But it was his children that spoke reason to him in the summer of '59, in his apartment in Paris, telling him that writers need to make money, and it's a job like any other, so he needn't feel badly about these cabbages. His teenage children visited him in Paris for 3 months, in the summer, in a rented apartment on Avenue Victor Hugo, and this was the foundation for his book, Not Dying. In that book, he argued that it could have just as easily been named All of the Days of July 1959 instead. In Lee Lawrence's biography, Aram described that summer as boring, waiting around while William wrote Not Dying. Aram was 16 and Lucy was 13. Still, William enjoyed that summer with them, even though around that time he admits he was emotionally punishing them in lieu of their mother. And then, the summer ended with Carol marrying Walter Matthau, to Saroyan's disappointment, and just days before his 51st birthday. Near the Georges Cinq, he went to the Aviation Club, just down the Champs-Élysées, to do his gambling, on baccarat and chemin de fer. This casino opened in 1907 and closed in 2014 after a police raid. Here he became known as a loud regular, often lending money to the dishonest types around him. In chance meetings, he describes these other regulars at the Aviation Club as a whole slew of gamblers, hustlers, hangers-on, con men, pimps, underworld characters, detectives, Corsican casino workers, Armenians, American blacks, African blacks, Asians, and a good variety of all-around international mothers. 1959 was actually a very productive year for him, perhaps because of the pressure to pay his debts while still gambling his gains away. Stanford's Saroyan collection shows that he was busy writing manuscripts that year. Some of them published, others not. These were the omnibus script, Ah, Sweet Mystery of Mrs. Murphy, which aired in March 1959, My Drawings, a collection of essays, I Go Now to Australia, a personal narrative collection that was not published, The Old and the New and 11 other playlets, and The Playwright and the Public, Kangaroo and Boomerang, and his series about American expatriates, Joey in the Pouch or the Australian comedy, Nobody in His Right Mind or the Moscow comedy, and later the London comedy or Sam, the Highest Jumper of Them All, in addition to Not Dying. In this chapter, he encounters Charles Feldman, a Hollywood agent who expresses concern that Saroyan is still gambling. Saroyan writes, I just couldn't find the words with which to tell him everybody I knew was making big money without any more effort than a few phone calls and a few meetings while I was still writing. Yes, I said, it seems to help me stay at my work. Saroyan was a writer's writer. He never stopped and he never pivoted to fancier roles in the industry. Of his many methods of moving swiftly, gambling and writing occupied his mind for his entire life. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.